if you don't have an execution path and have some sense that it's viable, right? We can do that, not only from a cost and time perspective, which, by the way, you need to then sanity check against, well, does that then capture value within the time frame that makes the deal worth it? But you also need to understand, are we as an organization capable? Do we have the capabilities to do that? And sometimes the answer is not quite. Like maybe you don't have the domain expertise to execute in a certain space or build a certain capability. Maybe you don't have everything you need, again, just from an internal systems and policies perspective, to bring a certain offering to market. So I would say start early, but then plan to iterate and build out and eventually operationalize before close that go-to-market strategy.
Welcome to M&A Science Live, where leading M&A practitioners share lessons learned from their experience. If you're interested in keeping up with the latest from M&A Science, visit mascience.com and subscribe to our free newsletter. Every Monday, we share highlights from our interviews and publications so you can continuously improve your M&A skills. Again, that's mascience.com. I'm your host, Kisan Patel, CEO and founder of M&A Science. Joining me today is Gwen Pope, head of Global Product M&A Strategic Partnerships at eBay. Gwen has 20 years of experience in enterprise software arena, with the past 12 focused on M&A cloud technologies. Today, we're going to talk about how to plan and go to market for successful integration outcomes. How are you doing today, Gwen?
Wonderful. Happy to be here. No, scratch that. Thrilled to be here. I think that honestly, there's nothing more valuable than talking with friends and colleagues about, okay, now what did that mean, right? What worked, what didn't, what was awesome, what was not, what represents an opportunity to maybe stick a pin in something for use later and iterate on it. So I'm a absolute sucker for problem solving. And of course, M&A is chock full of complex problems. So yes, super happy to be here.
We have that in common. Could you kick us off with just a brief on your background and your M&A experience?
Yes, happy to. So as you mentioned, at the moment, I'm heading up M&A and strategic partnerships for the Global Product organization at eBay. I should probably mention a quick aside. I'm not talking today representing eBay or any of my past employers, but of course, I'm here to share more generically based on that experience and others. Prior to eBay, I have focused on M&A specifically for about 15 years plus, and that stretched back through Google Cloud. Most recently, I've probably worked with some of your audience members, or crossed their paths while I was at Google. If not, then try Deloitte for a couple of years on an M&A advisory team, working with clients such as HP. Prior to that, was with Microsoft for a number of years, working also in M&A, but on another side of the cross-functional table, so to speak. Before that, my roles were, they were going through a pivot, a transition. I think it's probably safe to say that most of us that end up in an M&A oriented career have arrived here through sort of a serpentine path. I think that, at least in my humble opinion, that most folks that succeed in M&A do so because they can look through multiple lenses, right? Switch hats and think, okay, what does this mean? From the product and engineering perspective, what does this mean through a business lens? How about commercial operations? How about, contracting and legal, et cetera? So to have that multifaceted, experience, I think has been really both fulfilling and super valuable in approaching my current role. But if you stretch back more than 15 years or so, you would find me in increasingly technical roles. So I spent some time at Apple focused on service-oriented architecture, setting up a global center of excellence around that. Prior to that was with Oracle for a number of years, and that was focused on originally pre-sales and consulting around solution architecture for SOA. So focused on middleware, application integration, et cetera. That was during the time of the BEA middleware acquisition, and really represented the first point where I started to nudge towards the pivot for M&A work. So in the interest of time, I won't go back even more years from that.
But I'm seeing a theme. It's very, you have the diversified operational experience as sort of lend to this comprehensive understanding of how these pieces through an organization come together and work together.
Exactly. Yep. And I was going to say that if you look back even farther than that, you would find me with hands-on coding as part of my role. So nobody should test my my technical skills specific to certain technologies necessarily, but I'm not that rusty.
So the best in M&A have engineering backgrounds. You ready to talk about go-to-market?
Yes, let's do it.
What's the difference between building a go-to-market plan for a new product and a go-to-market plan for integration?
That's an awesome question. So first, I will play devil's advocate and say the delta is not as wide as you might think. And really, the goal is to, within the context of your own organization, to understand each piece, how you as a company launch new products normally, and then what makes sense for bringing in something that's acquired, which just by the nature of it will entail some non-standard elements, maybe infrastructure pieces or operating criteria, billing models, legal terms, et cetera. There's many things that might be not what your company normally does, right? Or maybe even things that you find need immediate remediation, for compliance or other reasons. And so in many ways, you're going to have to take that and then eventually end up, right, closer to, or maybe, fully remediated so that you can then bring it to market and operate it in market as you normally would, right? So that's my first call out, is really think of it as it shouldn't be that far apart. But with that said, the planning for integrating, an acquired product, the key difference is that you have to build that bridge. You have to envision, okay, here's the starting point, right? And of course, you gather insights through diligence. You understand as much as you can pre-close about how does this represent something that not only holds value for you, ultimately, but that to get that value, whether it's driving adoption within a certain customer segment or establishing your company as a thought leader or presence in a new space, et cetera, that you're going to have to get it to the endpoint to do the value capture. And what I mean by endpoint is that as much as possible, business as usual, standards-based go-to-market. So that's the key difference. And I would say that to do that really requires a solid understanding of not only how you normally would bring something to market and what your what your go-to-market readiness and go-to-market launch process is, but also between the lines, what exceptions, what variances, right? What interim processes and policies will you probably be able to get approved and, and put in place? And that forms the middle of your bridge, right?
As you're talking about this, I keep thinking about building a new house versus buying a fixer-upper.
That's an awesome observation. That's exactly it too, right? You're going to have to work with some stuff that maybe you don't love, right? And that ultimately you could remodel that, or maybe think, wait a minute, that's a legacy fixture that I love. It's this antique chandelier or what have you, right? That's an arched doorway that I might not have planned from the get-go, but I want to bring that forward. Yeah. And so in many respects, there's technology, there's people, there's culture, there's elements where you might decide, you know what, we're going to keep that. And in some cases, you might even think, I want to take that and infuse something new, within the acquiring organization. So that's a great point.
Let's talk more about the challenges. What are some of the common obstacles for bringing an acquired product to the market?
Yeah, I think that people that have worked with me know that I'm prone to stating the obvious to set the table for topics like this. Communication is key. Understanding the sort of air traffic control job that you have as a deal lead, or whatever your role is within M&A in your organization, chances are that part of your charter is to play air traffic control for the information that flows through your scope and that intersects other people's scope, right? So understanding from the get-go who needs to know what, who's going to be responsible for really cycling through the inevitable cycle of decisions. Early on, it's really key to set the table with a minimum viable, meaning not over-processed, not over-analyzed, and certainly don't have access to all of the inputs and insights that you want and that you will eventually have access to within post-LOI diligence, but that you form a minimum viable rationale. It's really just a thesis. And you're saying, okay, from a product engineering and go-to-market / business leadership perspective, you sit down and you think, okay, what is the thesis here? Why would we do this? What does that value look like that we're after? If you don't do that early on and then iterate, for instance, if you wait until post-LOI diligence, or in my humble opinion, even worse, wait until after close to really fully understand why do this and what are we after in this, and how do we capture that value, then you're really missing a key guardrail. And I would argue a key guardrail even in diligence, because diligence is about, it's in the term, confirmatory diligence. It's about confirming or adjusting your original thesis.
Well, this is a great place.
That's the soapbox there that I'll start with. You've got to understand from the get-go at least a working, minimum viable model of why, right? I would say another good soapbox topic is back to the bridge analogy. You need to understand where the gaps, the capability gaps, issues, and honestly, skeletons in the closet are, right? Know where the bodies are buried as far as your internal operations from a go-to-market perspective. If you consider how you normally bring things to market, again, back to the bridge metaphor, if and that endpoint, you know that there are serious challenges around certain aspects, and maybe that's the fact that your company is going through a major shift in how you think about commercial operations. or maybe you're doing a big contracting strategy shift to move towards a more unified, consolidated contracting model, which is fantastic. But in the midst of that, or maybe it's in the midst of a migration in billing and payment systems, lead to cash systems, something like that, you need to know that's going to create some X factors and possibly some challenges for your integration path. So again, know where those bodies are buried, understand the challenges for that endpoint, because knowing the starting point, which is your rationale and how you think you're going to execute, is only as good as knowing the endpoint as well.
I got a few questions on that. I'm wondering if we could, from the beginning planning part, you made a good point around it. I wanted to get an idea of when you should start thinking about it, because you gave good ideas what happens when you don't start early enough. But what's the best practice? Because I've heard extremes of this from, I think my favorite is Carlos Sesta, where after 20 years and doing retrospectives with CEOs 6 months post doing the deal, the number one lesson he learned was none of them were prepared for integration. So he brings his integration lead all the way to the front end of the process and has them develop an outline of a go-to-market before LOI and says that, hey, let's get aligned so you at least start thinking about how you're going to be involved and what this is going to look like making this happen. And then as they go through diligence, they create a work stream for integration planning and iteratively do it. And that becomes deliverable. What do you think? How have you seen it played out versus how you would have liked it to play it out?
Yeah, I would completely condone that thinking. But I should quickly follow up and qualify when we say start that integration planning, and specifically right now we're talking about the go-to-market integration, but starting integration planning and understanding what that strategy is early on doesn't mean obviously a full-blown integration plan. Not only is it impossible because you don't have all the inputs to flesh out a robust integration plan, nor is it feasible or even advisable to have a large enough tent and take up cross-functional resources and bandwidth and internally to really operationalize your go-to-market strategy, your go-to-market integration strategy. So what we're talking about is early on, as part of the rationale definition, you should be able to envision the execution path to capture the value that you're indicating within the rationale, right? So if you say this deal makes sense associated with this specific target because we're going to both drive adoption and grow revenue. And here's, of course, the underlying couple of assumptions around that means direct revenue, it means synergies, it means uplift to these existing products, et cetera. But the go-to-market integration plan and the strategy for that is essentially the vehicle to the value capture. So if you're not at least putting together sort of a t-shirt size idea of this is the execution path to that value, then that's coming up with the the plans for the house, right, that you pointed to earlier on, without any idea how that might get built, right? Are you going to build it out of bricks? Are you going to, is it going to be a tree house? If you don't have an execution path and have some sense that it's viable, right? We can do that, not only from a cost and time perspective, which, by the way, you need to then sanity check against, well, does that then capture value within the time frame that makes the deal worth it? But you also need to understand, are we as an organization capable? Do we have the capabilities to do that? And sometimes the answer is not quite. Like maybe you don't have the domain expertise to execute in a certain space or build a certain capability. Maybe you don't have everything you need, again, just from an internal systems and policies perspective, to bring a certain offering to market. So I would say start early, but then plan to iterate and build out and eventually operationalize before close that go-to-market strategy.
I like the word envision execution path. I'm going to teach that to my kids when I get home. That's the right way to look at it. And I'm still stuck on when do you start doing that activity? Like, can we make up an example?
Yes.
I'm buying your company, or, I want to acquire your business. We agree to, well, I got a general financial model and I put a price in front, but even before that, I'm sort of giving you a glimpse of the idea of what we're trying to do. And is there a rationale for buying it at a high level? But now we're getting to the point where, okay, how are we actually going to do this? Because there's things that really need to happen for this to work. And so I'm after LOI, right?
No.
No.
Yeah,
No.
I would completely push back on that. Let's step back even
Okay.
further. Now, obviously, there are different scenarios for how you get to the point that you just described, right? Sometimes there are opportunities that just emerge and you have to act fast and it's time sensitive. Maybe there's competitive bids, et cetera. You don't have a lot of time to, jump in and quickly assess, does this make sense? Okay, let's start talking about an LOI. Let's go.
Yep.
That's one very specific edge case that I'm going to set aside for the moment.
All the auctions.
But generally speaking, I would say there's inbound inquiries, right? Bankers, companies, reaching out directly to a potential acquirer and saying, "Hey, here's this opportunity. Is this something that that merits a conversation?" There's that, and then there's also the constant, brewing pot of ideas. Some of them good, some of them not good. Around, hey, we're trying to solve a certain problem. And, there's a varying degree of maturity around this thinking usually. Sometimes it's directly mapped to a roadmap gap. And we say, hey, we know that we needed to fill this. Let's get going and start thinking about, not specific to a target yet, a potential target, but how do we solve this problem? And so that's obviously very early stage. And so when you start thinking about how do we solve this problem, and it's about capability X, or it's about how do we drive adoption in this, in this space, then it's at that point that you start thinking, okay, here's the rationale. We want to drive adoption, we want to grow revenue, enter the space, et cetera. And here's how we would execute at a very high level, right? So it's this multifaceted package.
Before you're talking to anybody.
That's right. Ideally. Yeah, that doesn't always happen, but that's the ideal. Now, at a point where invariably and also internally, as the starting point, someone says, well, hey, that problem that we've been knocking around and thought, that we needed to solve with some urgency, here's an idea. How about company X, right? And then maybe it's compelling and it starts getting some momentum and traction amongst leadership. And they think, yes, let's put together a business case. Let's put together a brief that says, here's what we want to do. Let's run it up the flagpole with some urgency. Let's get going, right? So that's target specific, but there too, you need to have that business case, even if it's just 2 pages. Here's why we would do it. Here's how we would capture the value. And the how should include, what is the offering that you think you're bringing to market? Is it a standalone thing? Is it an add-on, right? An upsell to something that you have existing? Is there a services piece? Is there a premium support offering, right? So think of it from a holistic offering perspective. How would we sell it? Is it something we charge for? Is the services piece really the hook? But then the licensing is where we, make more of a margin, or is it the reverse, right? So really understanding what is that you think you're bringing to market, and how are you moving the needle based on the monetization approach? that's the piece that I'm really pushing everyone to think about. How can that be at least drafted at a high level, envisioned at a high level really early on?
Yeah.
Again, aside from that urgent, specific track that you mentioned in the beginning.
No, this is better. This is way better. Yeah. Rationale, I understand that. And there's a whole talk track around making sure you got a clear strategy and you know what you're going after. But the defining the execution path that early is part of it, and saying, all right, let's shape this in mind a little bit. Let's sort of take our vision, but walk through a bit of a journey to get there. And
Yes.
I like that. Yeah. I
So yes, just to again be provocative. It's not always possible, and we've all found ourselves in the position of rolling with the punches, right? Especially for a top-down acquisition initiative. I've even been put in a plugged into a initiative that was literally 2 weeks from close, right? Hey, guess what? We're doing this. And we've, most of us have had to work with that, and you just do it, and you find yourself putting together a capture of the rationale, usually going back to the top line executive that started the thing in the first place, and saying, okay, look, I need half an hour. We're going to sit down and I'm going to capture, capture your pearls of wisdom, because we need to capture the rationale to, help us plan, et cetera. But
we're buying this. Nope, I don't care.
and that does happen, obviously. Yep.
Okay. So we got through this front end. So there's a variable too from there where you think about it, and then you have at least something to build off of as you identify a specific target. And I'm curious, like, how early you would possibly get involved to try to shape that with the target company, because I feel like that's the whole other thing. Is now we got this off the rack sort of thing, something to start with, but then really tailoring it for the deal that we're working on.
Yeah, and I think it's a great question. Something that one should always keep in mind as you step into kicking off confirmatory diligence. So as of LOI, is based on the deal type. Are we just, are we carving out an asset from a larger organization? Is this essentially an acqui-hire? Are we going after this, looking at a, complex multi-product line operating model where we're going to take most or all of that product line and then transition it to products that we directly have in market or integrated with existing products, et cetera? That's going to guide then the necessary approach to how you engage the target leadership in crafting the preliminary integration plan. And obviously there needs to be some necessary partitioning, particularly when it's a deal that's subject to regulatory review. You need to be very careful about partitioning how you discuss, for instance, pricing strategy, or what you're going to do with transitioning customers or partners, to into a go forward state. But that aside, generally speaking, if you consider the type of deal and then also the go-to-market scenario, what I mean by that is when you consider the go-to-market integration strategy that should have ideally been considered and at least high level envisioned very early on, you could be looking at a situation where it's going to be a new standalone product. It's going to be a new feature, right, that's tucked into and integrated very tightly into an existing product you have, or maybe a new one that you already have in motion and are intending to release, but it needs that special sauce of that feature that you're acquiring. Or maybe it's an acqui-hire. You're looking at really key talent with deep technology expertise or some other domain expertise that you want so that they can help you build whatever it is you're intending to bring to market. That's going to guide how you think about engaging that target leadership to set expectations, right? Because part of it is planning and getting their input, and obviously their invaluable expertise and perspective in thinking about the eventual post-close go-to-market strategy. But it's also about setting expectations. You need to think about where might you need to diplomatically be prescriptive so that they understand, well, given the parameters of the deal and given the baseline objectives here, we're looking at collective success, right? You want to engage them and demonstrate that you care very much about how you're bringing things forward. But the sensitive part is, the delicate part is often around scenarios where you intend to sunset something, right? If you're deprecating and then eventually winding down a product that post-close becomes a legacy product, then that's something that is really best executed if there's a way to start setting those expectations and sharing awareness and collaboratively drafting that integration plan with the target leadership, so that once you get to the point of day one and post day one kickoff of rubber meets the road, here we go into integration execution, then you don't end up spinning your gears and wasting time on debate and pivot and stall around, do we really need to do this? Are we really sunsetting this? Do we really need to stop charging for this because the larger acquiring company, it's more trouble than it's worth, or more cost than it's worth to charge for it, et cetera. These are all considerations that are best orchestrated if you start to plan jointly within diligence.
Collaborative success.
Yes.
That should be your play. Collaborative success, actually work together with the target company. But that sounds like every time you give these examples, I keep getting in the back of my head that this is another reason why auctions are dangerous. Auctions are dangerous because you don't have time for any of this, especially now in this market. You don't literally have time at all. So it's just along the way, you're building a case of why you should have proprietary deal flow a lot more than your inbound stuff.
Yeah, and that's not to knock inbound channel. There's certainly opportunities there that can be unexpected gems, and that's another reason why I would say that it's really another indicator that highlights the value of, at least to a rough draft extent, having your own house in order with a capture of the thinking around what are our priorities right now around roadmap gaps, around sort of execution gaps, where it might make sense, or maybe even explicitly make sense, to pull that inorganic lever. Because one thing that I'll just circle back to the very top level, early stage thinking to highlight is that buy is just one strategic lever, obviously. Yep. And one of the things that you need to be prepared to walk your leadership, walk your potential prospective deal sponsors through early on is, how does this make sense as a path overall, right? Does it make sense to buy? And does it make sense to build instead, or to partner instead? Or maybe it's a combination. And often it is a combination if it's a more complex, broad scoped initiative. Let's say that you want to enter a certain space that you're not in. And to do that, you're going to build some baseline components, some fundamental pieces of that capability, but you really don't have the domain expertise internally to build all of it. And nor do you have representation as a thought leader, right? as a operating player in that space. So then you have to go think about, do we acquire certain players that have a brand name, that are well known in the space, that are thought leaders, and also have the domain expertise to help build and operate that sort of technology or offering. And then you also think, and does it make sense to partner either instead or pieces of that? And so that's part of the value of the early stage validation of what are we trying to solve and how might we do it. And I would say that the part of what this takes you down is, once you get to the point of kicking off confirmatory diligence, that even if you are on a fast track and you were rushed to that point, because to your early example, okay, we're doing this, right? Because of an inbound opportunity that was time sensitive or a top-down initiative, then you have that sort of cheat sheet of priorities and how does this line up with and make sense with what's already in our roadmap? Because that's so crucial to understand how that makes sense. How would this acquisition or any other make sense against the backdrop of what we're building and what we intend to build next year? What's on the horizon, and where do we really need to buy or acquire to meet these needs in parallel? So I think that's a really key piece. And then that, of course, takes you into, okay, well then, what is in your go-to-market integration plan? What is the scope of it? And I know we were going to get to that at some point, but
no, we should actually. No, we should. That's I liked where you're going with it. I think the moral is, you can't be lazy in this market. You need to do a lot of work up front, build out these templates, so that way you're prepared, even if you're in a high pressure sort of type of sale. Probably could say it's better to be in the latter side. So be proactive on your deal sourcing as well. But let's get into, like, how do we build this plan out? What are the factors you should consider when building your go-to-market integration plan?
Yeah, and here I want to be sensitive to the fact that most organizations, I would argue, don't have a whole lot of dedicated M&A focused resources. Most organizations are in some middle ground of, you have a few folks or a few teams that are dedicated to M&A work, and then you have a bunch of what many of us refer to as a volunteer fire department, where you have folks that have worked on deals, have contributed to deals. You've roped them in to advise on some aspect of integration planning, or maybe you needed a subject matter expert around sales models, or how do we operationalize, right, for products that we launch in-house. Again, back to the importance of understanding how do you bring things to market. But I would say it's really key to take the time to get inputs, gather guidance from folks internally that do have that knowledge, who aren't necessarily M&A specific, and in fact usually aren't. They're focused on sales ops, they're focused on commercial legal, HR, et cetera, and to understand, here's the common pieces that typically tie into an acquisition within your company, right? And I usually refer to this as baseline deliverables. Know the common denominator, know what you probably need to plan around. Again, whether it's giving a heads up to the commercial legal team and saying, okay, here we are at a certain point within confirmatory diligence. We have this outsourced team that's doing the contract scrub, right, of stuff that's in the data room from the target company. But here this comes, right? And if we close, then there's going to be this new product, at least for some period of time, right, depending on the integration path. And we're going to need to invariably sell and operate it with maybe some non-standard terms, right? What does that mean? Who's going to sell it? How do we contract? So these are all things that are just rough examples of common denominator baseline deliverables. If it's something around a acquisition or an acquired customer transition plan, right? That's a usual suspect. An acquired partner transition plan usually have something around contracting transition plan. You'll have something around sales, activation, and enablement. Who's going to sell it? You need to start to enable your internal sales teams usually at some point, assuming that you're bringing that product forward. So all of these sort of work stream specific, function specific plans are sort of a double click below the layer of your overall go-to-market integration strategy, your sort of guardrail assumptions. We're going to do X with product Y. We're going to sell it to this customer segment in this way, charge this way, et cetera. Those are the guardrails. But then the double click below that is usually the assortment of work stream and function specific integration plans. And that's where you see the baseline deliverables. And so what I'm suggesting is to, as you, of course, in parallel support the pipeline and the in-flight projects, right? The trick is to start to build that capture of baseline deliverables, because then that will let you literally build a spreadsheet of checklist. Okay, at this phase, we know that we need to do this with commercial legal. We need to do this and start to work with sales ops, do this and start to work with the support organization, et cetera. So I would think of it as building blocks on a per function basis and understand what usually is going to need to be in those building blocks. And then as you have the time and as you learn over the course of deals that get executed, you start to pick out patterns of the edge cases, the variables, right? What if we do this sort of deal? How do we need to transition? How do we need to, for instance, if something is billed on a consumption basis and we're going to transition that into a product that is billed on a subscription basis, that's just a random example.
Yep.
But the point being that there's some interesting and not common denominator deliverables, but some interesting variables that will crop up here and there that are good to pin. But again, it's the baseline deliverables you need to understand first.
Got it. Then what? Like, because I'm curious about the whole part of you're learning this and you're creating the capture around this, so that again you got this adaptive plan for the company that you're specifically acquiring, but then going to shift over to actually like execute on all of that is a whole other thing.
Yeah. So I would say if you take yourself back to the kickoff of confirmatory diligence, usually whether they're dedicated resources or not, you end up with this SWAT team of cross-functional delegates, right? Someone who's representing the priorities and interests and planning considerations for support, for sales, legal, finance, et cetera. And those folks are going to be on the hook for providing you really the t-shirt size estimates for here's what we think this would take in terms of time. Here's what we think about anything that is a particular or potential notable risk issue. Here's an X factor, right? And they'll start to populate that high-level spreadsheet for you, the integration tracker that's built around those per function assumptions. And at that point, we're really talking about 5 or 6 line items max, right, per function. What are the really high-level pieces that you need to see defined and fall into place to be able to execute? So I guess to put it another way, figure out what the critical path is for each of those functions to be able to get to that integrated state, whatever that end state is, right? That you're aiming for. And again, that depends on the deal scenario and the go-to-market strategy.
Agree. So let's say common deals, pretty sizable. When would they actually do that? And How does that activity come and play with the diligence work they have to do and not screw up?
So it's obviously a tricky balance, but I typically like to, and this may sound counterintuitive. Hopefully, I can explain the logic, but I'd like to kick off internal working sessions on building out the integration roadmap assumptions. Again, you should have some very nutshell idea of what those guardrail assumptions are at the outset, but building that out, starting to flesh out through debate and validation and testing the assumptions and figuring out what key inputs you need to be able to build out further. Start doing that 1 to 2 weeks in confirmatory diligence, right? So you fire up the series of working sessions, and I'm usually very careful to qualify it as such, to help people think more fluidly, to help them not get wrapped around the axle of, hey, we're in diligence, why are we doing integration planning, right? And then as you start to build that out, you get to a point, it's usually about halfway through confirmatory diligence, where you have a meaningful enough model of what you think the go-to-market integration plan looks like. And at this point, it's not exactly operationalized, right? But you have this meaningful model where you think you have enough substance to then run it up to the senior leadership, right? That represents the deal sponsor, cross-functional deal sponsor team, run it up to them, get buy-in, make sure there's alignment on that, and then start to kick off the joint discussions. So you have then, again, heavily dependent on what the scenario is, how prescriptive you need to be with setting direction for what that integration path is. But start having the joint discussions with the target leadership, and depending on the size of the company, sometimes it's the whole team, but start talking about, here's the set of foundational assumptions that we developed internally. Here's our directional thinking. And now we want to open it up to get inputs and get your help validating the viability of certain pieces that we have defined as either needed, maybe it's a compliance oriented thing, or you need to be able to bring a product up to certain remediation criteria, et cetera. And also maybe you have options, maybe you have scenarios around how are we going to get more lift out of that services model, or how are we going to improve the margin around this specific product within your portfolio, right? Because chances are they're going to have some really valuable insight and probably know better than you about a lot of those pieces. So kicking off the joint discussions and then ending up at a point where you are ideally before sign of the definitive agreement, but you get to a point shortly before close where then you have a relatively baked integration plan. Footnote, there's always course adjustments, right?
Right. Well, when you're working with the target side, you're working with somebody in like a functional lead, are you just working with that person directly, or do you have your functions on your side also part of it?
It depends on the scale of the organization, obviously.
Okay.
It also depends a bit on there might be factors around, again, maybe there's regulatory review in the mix. There might be factors that indicate the need to keep the tent small. Maybe the target company is a public organization, right? And you can't bring everybody that you want into the fold. Then you just need to work with deal sponsors on both sides to then selectively cherry pick subject matter experts. And often in that case, you need to be able to turn around and discreetly and generically go hunt for insights. I myself have had to do that many times where I needed to, keep separate our go-to-market organization and operations that are part of the business as usual world, and an M&A project where maybe we needed to know, okay, what's the overlap between the target company's customer list and our customer list? That's a very recurring task, right? Especially when you're looking at, with a larger company, they might have some really top tier customers that you already have, and you need to consider the transition very carefully. You need to consider maybe just before close, giving a quick courtesy heads up to the enterprise sales reps or account managers that are handling those customers, that sort of thing. So my point being, back to your question, you're going to have some constraints around who you can bring in.
Yep.
But the idea is to understand why you're bringing them in, right?
So you know if you need to,
what
or
are
who
you
you should.
expecting from them exactly? And then how does that feed into either building the integration plan, or maybe some of the people plugged in are specifically for the purpose of approving it, right? For gaining that alignment that's so critical before close, that table setting, right, for expectations that you'll need.
We have so much in our outline we haven't covered. I'm looking at this. I'm like, do we need to make a part 2, or should I try to go this and rapid fire questions with you? So tough.
It's up to you.
We have how to get people aligned around goals and strategies in that part. And then we didn't talk about pressure testing the rationale. And you're really good at explaining this stuff.
I think we've woven through sort of a intersecting thread through a lot of these things, even though we didn't explicitly kick off with a leading question. So for instance, if you take, how do you get people aligned around the goals and strategy, right? Mm-hmm. So back to the PSA about clear communication, right? Think about who's going to need to know what portion of the information around the plan, the strategy, who inputs into it, who makes the decisions on it. You build trust, the target company, particularly the leadership. But then I would say that internal stakeholder alignment that we touched on before, ideally starting way back in the early stage discussions of why would we do this? What might we do? What target companies make sense, et cetera. That then also gives you a beacon with which to then go down a path and not only facilitate internal roadmap sessions around building out the integration plan, the integration assumptions, but then also to start facilitating the joint integration roadmap sessions. So I think that's just one example of how I think that we've gracefully sidestepped around a lot of these topics and dipped our toes into it. Where would you like to?
Well, that was the other part. We're pretty much off script this whole time. How about we touch on the pressure testing rationale?
Yeah, that's a great one. So there's I've long ago learned that you're never going to get all the time that you want, nor the focused attention, the dedicated attention that you want from the internal leadership that represents your deal sponsors or prospective deal sponsors, right? So you need to, again, in parallel to supporting things that are in flight, you need to start thinking about a core set of questions. What are the, if nothing else, if you only got maybe 20, 30 minutes from that product or engineering leader, that go-to-market leader, et cetera, to figure out, okay, what is this rationale? And why not partner or build instead, et cetera? What are those 5 questions, right? And that's going to ideally get at, in what form would we bring this to market? And that, of course, should open the can of worms of, is there something that gets sunsetted? Are we integrating it? Is it a feature? That sort of thing, right? why not build or partner? Or are there pieces, is it an and, right? Maybe it's not an or, it's an and. Also considering, how is this worth it, right? What's the value? Is it a hard dollar value, or is it a compelling intangible like domain expertise? And then my favorite, what would kill the deal, right? To push the thinking around, what if something significant came up during diligence that has the potential of just unplugging the whole idea, what would that be? Also, where does this sit in the stack of other competing priorities? That's a big one to understand, right? Is this, for that engineering leader, is this truly top of mind? Or is this just something, a bright, shiny object that's fun to think about? But then when the rubber meets the road for, hey, we need all hands on deck, we need those resources, we need that headcount that was promised to, flesh out this integration, execution, et cetera, to understand where this sits in priorities. And of course, that then points back to what we've touched on a couple times, the real value of understanding the backdrop of what are our strategic priorities and which of those do we expect to pull an inorganic strategic lever to execute, right? Because if something is on the table for, hey, let's do a deal around live streaming video, right, for whatever purpose, and you already know that that's a hot topic as far as a roadmap gap, or that it's something that is really top of mind for internal leadership, then you should already know some of the questions or the answers to the questions that you have on your hit list, right? So having that set of core questions invaluable, because then you can just say, you know what, I just need half an hour and I'll walk you through it, right? Wow. Go ahead and share the questions in advance, but honestly, you'll get into this, you get a muscle memory around navigating and guiding those deal sponsors through those questions. And last, I would say, develop and leverage scenarios to help guide their thinking, right? To prompt them to think, okay, this is what a scenario looks like. And I'm just talking about like 2 or 3 slides that highlights, here's a standalone offering. Here's something that's integrated into an existing product. Here's hey, we're sunsetting it and we're just leveraging domain expertise and key talent, et cetera. Outline those scenarios so that then you can further, hone and focus that guided interview, if you will, of deal sponsors. So I think that in a nutshell is it.
What's the craziest thing you've seen in M&A?
Let's see. Without naming any names,
no names
I'd
and
say
dates.
the craziest thing is, one of those, hey, we're doing it, and by the way, we're closing in just a few days. Craziest thing is to close in a few days and essentially be doing diligence and integration planning after you close, right? I've done that, and it's not fantastic. It's doable, but it's, you just know that you're going to stumble across things that it's like, if only we'd known.
I mean, is that like a fire sale that triggers that? Like, why would you do a deal like that?
I'd say there's a number of mix and match possible ingredients that, get you to that point. Certainly opportunity window is one of those. But also there's certainly competitive bid situations. There's an understanding that maybe certain target companies have extremely rare and compelling domain expertise or thought leadership. And if that target company becomes available, then maybe it's a no-brainer for that reason alone for the acquiring company. So it's like, nope, we're just going to do it and we're going to figure it all out later. right?
Hopefully nobody lost a bet at the bar. Gwen, I enjoyed this conversation. Thank you so much for spending the hour with me. I look forward to. You're a tough first interview. I'll just be honest and come out with that. I've done a lot of these interviews, and you're hard. You're really smart. So thank you so much.
Oh, thank you. It was my pleasure.